Loving Father, we do ask that you will plant our feet on higher ground, that you will give us the backbone and the faith to live for you in a world that's kind of spinning out of control. And may we be like Daniel. May we dare to be a Daniel in the place that you have put us. And again, we just ask a blessing over the ladies who are at their treasured event today and those who are elsewhere or those who are watching online. Give them a special blessing too. In Jesus' name, amen. So here's one link, lightbearers.org, resources, the unsealing of Daniel. You can go there and print out a PDF of the lessons there. In fact, that's the resource I'll have available for you for Daniel 7 next week at the end of the service. But Daniel 5, we're in a transition, but let's start with Revelation 14, verse 6, because Daniel really talks about worship. We've been talking about how Daniel worship shows up in Daniel 1, 2, 3, 4 is the testimony of Nebuchadnezzar, and now we're at chapter 5, which is Belshazzar, which is Nebuchadnezzar's grandson. Okay, about 20 years after Nebuchadnezzar passed away. But Revelation says this, Revelation 14, verse 6 and 7 says, "Then I saw another angel flying in the midst of heaven, having the everlasting gospel to preach to those who dwell on the earth, to every nation, tribe, tongue, and people, saying with a loud voice, Fear God and give glory to him, for the hour of his judgment has come. Worship him who has made heaven, the earth, the sea, and springs of water." You see, it's really all about worship. We often look at Daniel and Revelation in apocalyptic terms, prophetic terms, and that is true. There's a lot we can learn. We'll set that up for us next week. Okay? And Revelation picks up where Daniel leaves off, kind of a thing. But it's really about worship. You're going to see Babylon again. I'll actually share a verse or two out of Revelation referring to Babylon, even though Babylon today collapses in our study together, that philosophy remains. And it's really about worship of self, worship of confusion, worship of the world versus worship of God. And that's really what it comes down to. Who are you going to worship? Are you going to worship the world? Are you going to worship your own self, whatever that is? Or are you going to trust in God? Even though when everything else looks like that's the stupidest idea in the world, are you still going to hang on to Jesus? And that's what we've been studying as we've been looking at Daniel together. Here's a proverb, because we're going to hear this idea of weighed in the balance and found wanting. This comes out of Proverbs 16, 11 and 12. "A just balance and scales are the Lord's. All the weights in the bag are his work. It is an abomination to kings to do evil, for the throne is established in righteousness." Now, you're talking about kings here. Solomon wrote this, but we all have our own little kingdoms, whatever that might be, see? And the weights, how we're weighed, how we're judged, that all belongs to God. And our kingdom, however small or big it might be, belongs to God. I shared this last week. Well, it's worth sharing again, reminding us. This actually comes from the book Education, which is written by Ellen White. But this was actually, I found this quote from her in Forbes magazine under leadership. And they were using this quote from her. It's worth repeating in the light of Daniel and what we've been studying. The greatest want of the world is the want of men or women. Men or women who will not be bought or sold. Men or women who in their inmost souls are true and honest. Men and women who do not fear to call sin by its right name. Men and women whose conscience is as true to duty as the needle to the pole. Men and women who will stand for the right though the heavens fall. I tell you, it only takes maybe, you don't even have to read it. You can just scroll through the news feed and just look at the headlines and realize that still today in 2022, the want of the world is the want of men and women who will be true to duty, who will be honest, full of integrity, and stand for God, stand for right. So we come to Belshazzar, Nebuchadnezzar's grandson, who knew of his grandfather's conversion. So just real quickly, I didn't put a graph up there on there, but you had Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar had 7 years of insanity where he thought he was a cow or an ox, and then it was restored to him, and he was king for another couple years before he passed away. Daniel was there the whole time. His son, Evil Murdoch, probably helped run the kingdom when he was in his insanity phase or manic phase, but he had it next, and then his brother-in-law killed him, and he took over, and then Evil Murdoch's brother, Nabonidus, took over and got rid of his brother-in-law. And so there's this whole 20-year period of craziness happened there, but it reaches Daniel 5, and Nabonidus is actually king. Belshazzar is Nabonidus' son, who's actually ruling in Babylon. Nabonidus was busy fighting the Medes and Persians. Remember, now Daniel 2, you have the head of gold, you have the chest of silver, chest and arms of silver. Those are the Medes and Persians. They're fighting right now. They actually have Babylon surrounded right now in our story. And Belshazzar decides to throw a party to let everybody know everything's okay. And well, we'll see what happens. So this is this transition from the head of gold to the shoulders, arms, and chest of silver. Let's pick it up. This Babylon idea, as I mentioned earlier, even though they fall right here, there's a transition from one great power to another great power. That belief system of Babylon still remains intact. And you can see in Revelation 18, this is actually the last message to give to the world. After these things, I saw another angel coming down from heaven, having great authority. Angel is messenger, God's messenger, having great authority, and the earth was illuminated with his glory. And he cried cried mightily with a loud voice, saying, Babylon the Great is fallen, and has become a dwelling place of demons, a prison for every foul spirit, and a cage for every unclean and hated bird. So here's the final fall of Babylon, happens here in Revelation 18. And that generation of people who are living in this time, the time of the last days, needs to be going out and saying, guess what? The world system of selfishness, greed, lust, crime, hatred, all this kind of stuff is gone. You don't need to follow that. Follow God. Come out of that confusion. Come out of that mess into a relationship with Jesus. And that's what we should be doing. Okay? That's our duty as followers of Christ. So here we are, Daniel. Again, we see this cosmic outcome of false and faithful worship. And Daniel 5 and 6 delineates this in two stories. I just got a text message on my phone, and I had to see if it was showing up on the screen. It was about the shower trailer. No big deal, but anyway. Okay, so here's the setup. Let me set it up for you. You can read Daniel 5, but we'll set it up till we get into here. Daniel 5, as I said, Nabonidus is king. He's fighting the Medes and Persians. His son is a co-regent with him, governing in Babylon. He's really a party animal, and everyone liked Belshazzar and didn't really care for Nabonidus. And but Nabonidus was a general, and so he was doing that kind of a thing. So he throws a party. Belshazzar throws a party. We've already described that Babylon was probably one of the 7 ancient wonders of the ancient world. It had the river Euphrates flowing through it. It had impenetrable gates. Walls were like, they had chariot races on top of the walls. They were so big, and they had all kinds of food inside, so they felt really secure. And so he throws this party. As he's throwing this party, you can see behind the words here a shot of a hand writing on the wall, and it was writing this inscription on the wall in fire. And Belshazzar started shaking, like, his knees shaking and everything, and alcohol wore off, I guess, I don't know. But people are just shocked at what they're seeing. He calls his wise men to come in. No one can interpret it. And then his grandmother, says the queen mother in the Bible, that'd be his grandmother, comes in and says, there's one in the Jewish captives who your father He's not talking about Nabonidus. He's talking about grandfather. Your father used to talk to about the interpretation of dreams. Call him in. And he made this big promise, and he said, you'll be made third ruler of the kingdom. That should be a hint. Okay? Nabonidus, Belshazzar, third ruler. Okay? Even though Nabonidus isn't mentioned, it's in the history, it's in the oracles, it's in the cuneiform tablets. And so Daniel comes in. And he says, and you, his son, Belshazzar, have not humbled your heart, though you knew all this. He goes back and tells the story of his grandfather Nebuchadnezzar losing his mind, right? And then humbling himself before God. But you have lifted up yourself against the Lord of heaven, and the vessels of his house you have been brought in before you, and you and your lords and your wives and your concubines have drunk wine from them. They brought in the communion cups, the golden communion plates and cups from Jerusalem's temple that had been taken into Babylon and put in their treasury, and they brought them in and were drinking and partying out of those and giving glory. And you have praised the gods of silver and gold and bronze, iron, wood, and stone, which do not see or hear, but the Lord in whose hand is your breath, and whose are all your ways you have not honored. So he didn't give glory where glory was due, even though he knew about his grandfather. So here is what was written on the wall, and then Daniel interprets it. Mene, which God has numbered your kingdom. God has weighed your kingdom. Okay, you are going the wrong direction, and you're not returning to God. Okay, Tekel means you have been weighed in the balances and found wanting, and Perez, your kingdom is given to the Medes and Persians. So there's the prophecy that was written on the wall. Belshazzar was found wanting, and the kingdom was being given away. Transition here. Nebuchadnezzar, you see, eventually was found faithful. We read his testimony in Daniel chapter 4. We'll be able to see Nebuchadnezzar in heaven someday and talk about his engineering prowess or whatever, his conversion. Belshazzar was not faithful. He chose to worship other gods. Daniel was found faithful. The three Hebrews were found faithful. There are other people like Ezekiel and other people who were in that time frame who were faithful. The question is, what about you and I? When we are weighed in the balance, will we be found wanting? I didn't put this up there, so it's in Daniel chapter 8, or chapter 7 actually. We're going to talk a little bit about this next week, but in Daniel 7, in vision, Daniel sees that there was a throne. I watched until thrones were put in place, and the Ancient of Days was seated. That is, God was seated. His garment was white as snow, and his hair of his head was like pure wool. His throne was a fiery flame, its wheels a burning fire. A fiery stream issued and came forth from before him, and thousands upon thousands ministered to him. 10,000 times 10,000 stood before him. The court was seated, and the books were opened. If you study this idea of books in the Scripture, you will find there's 3 books. Okay? And when it's time for the judgment, the books are open. We're all going to be weighed at some point. Now, John gives us a lot of, 1 John gives us a lot of assurance. He says, those who have Jesus do not come into judgment. So if you want to avoid the judgment, hang out with Jesus. I mean, it's just like this. Hey, Steve, it's time for the judgment. Let me see, open it up. Jesus paid it all. Oh, okay. Let's go over here. He didn't come into judgment. The books were open, saw Jesus paid it all. Off to the next one. Let's go to Zach. Hey, Jesus paid it. Let's go over here. You don't come into judgment. You got Jesus, right? So if you're worried about the judgment, I grew up scared of the judgment, right? Because I knew I messed up. But it was great news when I found out that if I hang out with Jesus, I don't have to worry about the judgment. It's paid in full. It's paid in full. All right. We come to this message. This message is in Revelation chapter 3, 18, and so on. It's about the Laodicean church, the last church of the 7 churches. It's the church of, or the era of Christianity we're living in right now. Okay? And the word from heaven, from God, says, I counsel to you, because they would think they were rich and in need of nothing. Remember, it says, you're lukewarm. I'm just going to spit you out. I'm going to vomit you out because you're neither hot or cold. I prefer that you were either hot or cold, but because you're lukewarm, I'm just going to spit you out. Okay? But I'm going to counsel you to buy of me gold, refined in the fire, so that you may be rich, white garments, so that you may clothe yourselves, and the shame of your nakedness may not be seen, and salve to anoint your eyes, so that you may see. Gold. Talked about it in children's story. Gold is faith. It represents faith. God is asking the last day church to buy gold, to get into relationship with Him and receive faith. This comes from 1 Peter. That the genuineness of your faith, being much more precious than gold that perishes, though it is tested by fire, may be found to praise, honor, and glory at the revelation of Jesus Christ. Whom, having not seen, you love, though now you do not see Him, yet believing you rejoice with joy inexpressible and full of glory, receiving the end of your faith, the salvation of your souls. This faith can only come from God, and it gets refined and strengthened through testing, much like gold gets refined and purified through fire. So when God is saying to the Laodicean church, you guys thought you were rich, just like Babylon, in need of nothing, just like Babylon. You're just good to go, just like Babylon. We're having a party. So no, you're wretched, poor, blind, and naked is what it says there in Revelation. I counsel you buy some faith from me. Get a little righteousness going on, and you're going to need the Holy Spirit to make it all come together. That's the word for us today. So Babylon falls. That very night, it falls into the hands of the Medes and the Persians. So we've transitioned now from the head of gold to the chest and arms of silver. Chapter 7, you're going to still see Babylon represented there in the imagery in chapter 7 because it's during the first year of Belshazzar. So Babylon hadn't fallen in the time of chapter 7, but by the time you get to chapter 8, it's under the Mede and Persian rule, and so you don't see a representation for Babylon in chapter 8. But here's the Medes and the Persians. You can see it's quite a large territory. Cyrus was actually the king. We're going to talk about Darius. Darius was Cyrus's father-in-law, and he was in charge of Babylon. But Cyrus actually was the king of there. It was originally started out the Medes and Persians and just became the Persian Empire. But I want we're going to talk about the relationship between Darius and Daniel for a minute, and I'll show it up here. But in the Bible, it says Darius was 62 years old. By the time this is happening in Daniel, Daniel's about 82 years old. So when you're looking at that map, you can imagine in your mind's eye that a period of time where the Medes and the Persians were just tribal groups, and Babylon was ruling all of that. So when Darius gets into leadership, Daniel's already about 40 or 50 years of age, and Darius is in leadership. He's ruling the Medes, the tribal group of the Medes. He's having to negotiate with Babylon. He's going to negotiate with Daniel. Daniel's number 2 in Babylon, right? Nebuchadnezzar's not out negotiating treaties. He leaves that to the number 2, number 3 people, right? So there's a connection between Darius and Daniel prior to this moment. Logically, that would make sense. So faith, integrity, and worship in the face of death. This is much like the fiery furnace issue. Darius, who's referred to as Gabaru I, in the history writings, sought to make Daniel second ruler of the providence. Okay? So we're picking it up here in Daniel chapter 6. It pleased Darius to set over the kingdom 120 satraps to be over the whole kingdom. And over these 3 governors, of whom Daniel was one, that the satraps might give account to them, so the king would not suffer loss. Then this Daniel distinguished himself above the governors and satraps because of an excellent spirit was in him, and the king gave thought to setting him over the whole realm. So the governors and the satraps sought to find some charge against Daniel concerning the kingdom, but they could find no charge or fault, because he was faithful, nor was there any error or fault found in him. Then these men said, "We shall not find any charge against this Daniel unless we find it against him concerning the law of his God." So these governors and satraps thronged before the king and said thus to the king, "King Darius, live forever. All the governors of the kingdom, the administrators, satraps, the counselors, and advisors have consulted together to establish a royal statute and to make a firm decree that whoever petitions any god or man for 30 days, except you, O king, shall be cast into the den of lions. Now, O king, establish a decree, sign the writing, so that it cannot be changed according to the laws of the Medes and Persians, which does not alter." Therefore King Darius signed the written decree. This is much like Daniel 3. So you have Nebuchadnezzar sets up this golden image and calls the whole province to come together to worship the golden image as a illustration of their submittance to his power. And so it's the same idea here, and Darius is, "Oh yeah, this sounds great. No one can pray to anybody but me for 30 days. Oh yeah, this is awesome. Stroke my pride, right? Look at all these guys. Yeah, it's a good idea. I'll sign it." Doesn't think about the consequences. Going on. Now when Daniel knew that the writing was signed, he went home, closed his windows, got into the closet and closed the door. No. And in his upper room, with his windows open toward Jerusalem, he knelt down on his knees 3 times that day and prayed and gave thanks before his God, as was his custom. Since when? Early days. He made this a custom in his life. Then these men assembled and found Daniel praying and making supplication before his God. All right. And they went before the king and spoke concerning the king's decree. "Have you not signed a decree that every man who petitions any god or man within 30 days except you, O king, shall be cast into the den of lions?" And the king answered and said, "The thing is true, according to the laws of the Medes and Persians, which does not alter." So they answered and said before the king, "That Daniel, who is one of the captives from Judah, does not show due regard for you, O king, or for the decree that you have signed, but makes his petition 3 times a day." This is very, very interesting. Remember when we come to the Daniel 2, and Nebuchadnezzar is going to kill all the wise men, right? Just wipe them out. And Daniel says to Arioch, "Why is he so hasty? This doesn't seem normal." And he asks permission to go in before Nebuchadnezzar, and Nebuchadnezzar grants time for him to pray and supplicate God. Daniel and his 3 friends' faithfulness saved the other people. So 50 plus years later, some of them are still there, to the point that they say, "This is one of those captives from Judah." So they know Daniel. They've been watching Daniel. They've been jealous of Daniel for 50 years. Okay? They can't find any fault with him and what he does when he goes to work every day. He just does what he's supposed to do in a very integral, faithful way and honors God. And they are not honoring God. So they're out to get Daniel, and they remind Darius. Why does Darius need to know that he's from Judah? He didn't capture Judah. Nebuchadnezzar did. So you can kind of see that this has been going on a while when you read in between the lines a little bit. Well, this also tells you a lot about Darius and his relationship with Daniel. And the king, when he heard these words, was greatly displeased with himself, not with the wise men, counselors, and satraps. He got snookered. He got taken, okay? And it's going to hurt his friend. And he set his heart on Daniel to deliver him, and he labored till the going down of the sun to deliver him. Even though the laws of the Medes and Persians couldn't get changed, Darius was trying every way he could to change it. Because he had a friendship, he had a relationship with Daniel that he valued. This is interesting. God did not prevent Daniel's enemies from casting him into the lion's den. He permitted evil angels and wicked men thus far to accomplish their purpose. What it was that he might make the deliverance of his servant more marked, and the defeat of the enemies of truth and righteousness more complete. Put in context the story we have before us. We talked about Babylon being a place of confusion. It comes out of the Tower of Babel. Babylon is a place of confusion. Jerusalem was supposed to be the house of God. But by the time Nebuchadnezzar comes and conquers Jerusalem, Jerusalem had become confused. They didn't know where they were going. They were worshiping other gods. They weren't being faithful to God. And so God was disciplining them. And he chose Nebuchadnezzar to discipline. We talked about that last week. And so Jesus' followers, Daniel and his three friends specifically, come into Babylon and start preaching truth. And from the house of confusion comes out truth that should have come out of the house of God. You see that interesting connection? And here we are 50 years later. We have the testimony of Nebuchadnezzar that we read about in chapter 4 going through the whole world. We had the fiery furnace going through the whole world. Okay? And now it's about to happen again. God's going to get the message out, whether he uses us or not. We understand that? I have to tell you, an illustration happened in my life. So after I left education, I took a year off to figure out what I was going to do and follow God or not, I guess, and be a pastor, basically. I didn't want to do this. And so I took a year to God just keep knocking on my head. But we were in Spokane. I was helping. We were planting a church in Airway Heights, and we were looking to buy some property to build a church. And so there were some properties in town in 2008, and the crash had just kind of made property cheap. And so there was some property there in Airway Heights that we were looking to be perfect for the church. And it was part of a housing tract on one side, and there was a couple acres set off. So I went and started figuring out who I could talk to about the property. And someone said, you need to see Steve Entman. I went, oh, Steve Entman. In case those don't know who Steve Entman is, he was the number 1 draft pick for the Indianapolis Colts in 1991. Big guy. I'm standing on the stage, and he'd probably be taller than me and bigger. Big guy, defensive lineman. And don't know if he's a believer. Even to this day, I don't know if he's a believer, but he was interested in this property as well. So I went and met with Steve Entman. And we ended up buying that property, and Steve ended up buying the other portion. But in that relationship, I was reminded that God will use anybody to develop your faith. And he used Steve Entman to build my faith as we're planting a church in Airway Heights. He'll use anybody. And in this case, he's using Nebuchadnezzar, he's using Daniel and his three friends, he's using Darius, he's using everybody to communicate the message of salvation to a dying world. All right, so Daniel gets thrown into the lion's den. The king is all worked up, can't sleep. No music, no parties, no nothing going on. And early in the morning, at the break of day, the king arose and went in haste to the den, the lion's den. As he came near the den where Daniel was, he cried out in a tone of anguish. Tone of anguish. The king declared to Daniel, "O Daniel, servant of the living God, servant of the living God, has your God whom you serve continually been able to deliver you from the lions?" Then Daniel said to the king, "O king, live forever. My God sent his angel and shut the lion's mouth, and they have not harmed me, because I was found blameless before him, and also before you, O king. I have done no harm." Then the king was exceedingly glad and commanded that Daniel be taken up out of the den. And so Daniel was taken up out of the den, and no kind of harm was found on him, because he had trusted his God. Once more, a proclamation was issued by a heathen ruler exalting the God of Daniel as the true God. Yeah. Before we go to here, after Daniel has come out, I mean, he's like 85, whatever he is, 80, whatever. Too old to be going into a lion's den, right? He comes out, no hurt on him. The king says, "Hey, where are those satraps and those counselors and those people that snookered me? Go get them." Now, this is the consequences. Everybody, we've talked about Mount Carmel and Ahab leading the people into false worship, and then the famine affecting not just Israel but everywhere, right? When we men and women, but I'm going to speak to the men for a minute, make poor choices, it affects our whole family. Okay? It affects our wives, our kids, and everything. In this case, the men got thrown in, the wives got thrown in, and the kids got thrown in to the lion's den. Not a pretty picture. Back in Daniel 2, the wise men were saved, but they've had 50 years of time with Daniel and the others, like his three friends, etc., and they made their choice, and that ended up in the loss of their life. We have a choice as well. From the story of Daniel's deliverance, we may learn that in seasons of trial and bloom, God's children should be just what they were when their prospects were bright with hope and their surroundings all that they could desire. See, what happens when we get comfortable? The monthly bills are being paid, we get a little extra to put in savings, we got a little extra to buy some toys, everything is just hunky-dory, going on great. Oftentimes, I know it is about you, but in my life, my devotions slack. And in crisis, when things are all falling apart, then I get down on my knees and I get into the Bible and I start praying. That's not what happened in Daniel's case or his three friends. They were hanging out with Jesus, whether it was good or bad. There was no difference between what they were like on Wednesday and what they were like on Sabbath. Okay? In fact, I got just a little insight. They couldn't go to the synagogue on Sabbath. You realize they couldn't go to church. You realize that. So Sabbath was the same as every other day of the week. And the blessing of becoming eunuchs for them was that when they had their big parties and stuff, they didn't have to go because they were damaged goods. So it was a blessing to them. They didn't have to go to those big parties. But they were the same. They worshiped God every day of the week and let him fill their hearts with his love and care. A man whose heart is stayed upon God will be the same in the hour of his greatest trial as he is in prosperity, when the light of favor of God and of man beam upon him. Faith reaches to the unseen and grasps eternal realities. faith, that gold we were talking about, reaches to the unseen and grasps eternal realities. You see, there's a time coming that time of trouble, I think is one way they put it, as never was, or Jacob's time of trouble. But when we look at Revelation, you're going to see some of it foreshadowed in Daniel 7 next week. It's just going to get crazy, you guys. In fact, Ellen White will tell us that if time isn't cut short, the world would destroy itself. I mean, just think of what's happened with the Nord Stream 1 and 2 pipeline right now. You know, you read about the plagues and the different things that's recorded in Revelation, and, you know, sea creatures dying, and the ocean and rivers turning to blood. And, you know, we can do a lot of damage ourselves to this old world, right? You see it being played out. Who's going to want to go fishing in the Baltic Sea anytime soon? You know? We're going to just wipe ourselves out if God didn't come back. But it's by His grace.